This is Father Bertrand Janczyk.
This is Father Joseph Anthony Kress.
Welcome to Godsplaining. If you like this episode, consider becoming a monthly donor through patreon.com. You can like and subscribe to Godsplaining wherever you listen to your podcasts. Father Joseph Anthony.
Father Jacob Bertrand.
How you doing?
Oh, I'm living my best life.
Yeah?
Yeah, I'm living large.
Okay.
I love it. I recently got back from our time in St. Louis for the Sikh conference. Yeah. Took a bunch of students from UVA. I think we took about 30 students out to St. Louis, into the heartland of the Americas, you know.
Okay.
Yeah, the Gateway Arch. But it was unbelievable. Just a big shout out to the people at Focus who helped us and really welcomed us as a student body, but also as a podcast. We were able to record a live episode there on site. Had a great crowd that joined us for that. It was unbelievable. Just a wonderful time to spend with our students and growing in our faith and just building, and to be with 17,000, I think was the number that kept throwing out at us.
Okay.
Praying together in adoration, in confessions. It was just a really, really beautiful time. And, personally, just that like kind of booster shot kick in the rear end that I needed. So I'm ready to go. Like I want to take on the fall semester or the spring semester and just like really, really get after it. But so I'm in a good spot, just living large and doing all the good things. And it was nice way to kind of end. Was that 2022 and tie things off with that. Had a great Christmas, great New Year's, and then allow Seek to be that kind of launching point that's sending into this new year. So, just an amazing time. Great stuff going on.
That's awesome. Yeah, I didn't go to Seek this time around. I guess I'd gone for a number of years before when I was vocation director and stuff, but this year being at the parish kind of tied me down a little bit. But
it was something too. We hadn't done that in 2.5 years.
Yeah, because I hadn't been in person because of COVID. Yeah.
And I remember I was working with one of the production crew backstage on something, and it was the concert on like one of the final nights, and you just heard everybody and singing the lyrics and everything. And he just kind of paused for this moment and goes, "You hear that? We haven't heard that in 3 years. Like that's a beautiful sound."
Yeah.
And it was just really beautiful to have everybody together once again and moving forward.
Yeah, that's great. I think I'm kind of in a similar space to you, though I didn't go to Seek, but with just, a few weeks into the new year, not Christmas done, like thank God it's done, but Christmas is done, New Year's is done, kind of back into ordinary time for a little bit before Lent, but kind of excited to like keep, New Year, keep rolling, that sort of thing. So that's great. Cool. Okay. Well, today's episode is not about our being re-energized, our newfound zeal this
people
year.
Don't want to hear like how
not really. Maybe not. Probably not. Who knows? But on this episode, we're going to talk about, I was going to say a saint, not a saint. But we're going to talk about somebody named Father Jacques Philippe. I'm guessing that a lot of our listeners have heard of Father Philippe, maybe. He's pretty popular. But the idea that we had when we were kind of thinking, well, what would be some new interesting things to talk about would be, is to look at some sort of contemporary spiritual authors. And contemporary in a kind of broader sense. But we do, on the podcast, if you've listened, we have had and continue to have episodes on saints, on various aspects of spirituality, of living devotion in the Christian life. And we've had some stuff on the fathers of the church, some of the more ancient saints and these kind of things. But something that Father Joseph Anthony, myself, the other friars on the podcast also enjoy and find to be really helpful in our spiritual lives is reading contemporary spiritual authors.
Right.
So Father Jacques Philippe is one of those. We'll say a few words about him, but then focus a bit on his writing. But it's not a series in any sense, but we're, I think, going to try to incorporate some, contemporary people that we can recommend to all of you who are listening or watching, to help, continue furthering your relationship with Christ, deepening your relationship with Christ, these sort of things. So.
It's going to be something where like, we don't have any set idea. It's not like, okay, we're going to do a 7-episode series on contemporary spiritual. Right, It's just going to be like, hey, this is something that I think for us as friars has been very beneficial, and there are some really beautiful contemporary spiritual authors out there that it's going to be kind of common in the future that we'll have different contemporary spiritual authors that we turn to or start to talk about, because at the end of the day, like, these are authors that have, I think, influenced us and been helpful to assist us in our faith and growth and holiness. So we want to be able to share that.
Right.
And
exactly.
That's as simple as that. So,
well, yeah. And I shouldn't say we, but I often find myself wondering, like, I need something new or different to read. And, also a recommendation there. So we'll start with Father Jacques Philippe on today's episode. And Father, just say a few words about him, right? So Father Jacques Philippe is a French, I was going to say Dominican. He's not a Dominican.
No,
he's a
not.
French priest.
Yes.
He's still living. He's probably, I don't know, I'm guessing in his mid to late 60s-ish.
No idea.
You have no idea? Okay.
No idea.
I would guess around that age, but I could be off. He belongs to a religious community in France called the Community of the Beatitudes. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the sort of French religious life in the 20th century, but it has just kind of happened, not by happenstance, but it is the case that in France there have been a number of newer religious communities founded in the last 100 years, 150-ish years or so. Yeah. Some older, some newer, and the Community of the Beatitudes is one of those. So I don't know a ton about them, but I know that Father Philippe basically his kind of full-time ministry now is in the spiritual world. So the spiritual writing, he tours, he gives. Not tours, but travels to give retreats and preaching and that sort of thing. But yeah, is based out of France. And the story that I heard, and I don't know if it was from Father Philippe, because I've seen him give a couple talks. He's come to the States and that sort of thing. The story that I heard how he found the Community of the Beatitudes was that he was actually on his way to go visit, before he was a religious, to visit a Dominican community because he was discerning a vocation to the Dominicans. I don't know how seriously or not, but his car broke down on the way, and it was close enough, I don't know the exact details, but he ended up staying with the Community of the Beatitudes and found that, perhaps the Lord was calling him to this. So never made it to the Dominican priory. And that's how he met the Community of the Beatitudes. So like providence at work, maybe, probably. Yeah. I would have to say yes, but Father Philippe. So
it's amazing what a flat tire can do for your vocation, right?
That's right. Yeah. Awesome. So let's say a few general things about why we like Father Philippe and his writings. And then I think there are a handful of themes that kind of permeate his books that we can talk about to kind of, I don't know, elucidate some of his thoughts a bit. Father, what's attractive? What do you like about Father Philippe? Why do you think he's like to be recommended?
Yeah, a few things. I think he's very direct in his writing on the spiritual life. A lot can be written about the spiritual life, and it tends to be something that can be written very abstractly or flowery language, which is beautiful, but sometimes you are left as like, that was beautiful. I don't know what any of that was, but Father Philippe does not operate in that way. He can be very direct. He can be very simple. I think another aspect is his books are short. Like they're small, short books. You can grab them, take them to the chapel with you, and you don't feel like that's intimidating. So I think the first thing is all of his writings, his style, syntax, his content, and how it's packaged. Like I said, just short chapters, short books themselves are very accessible. And that's the thing that is really, really beautiful. This is something we're going to talk through, I think, probably a little later in this episode, but he's really, really, really focused on the foundations.
Right.
It's all about the foundational elements, and there's a real beauty to that. So I think for me, when I started reading his works and how he's influenced me in my own spiritual life and prayer is the fact that it's always about the foundations, which are perennial, and it's very, very accessible.
Yeah. Yeah, and I like that point about the foundations. I often will call them like the basics of Christian life, and the call to be a disciple, the call to grow in relationship with Christ, the call to live the Christian life. It's not a complicated call. No. Our lives are complicated. Our lives are messy. I'm not saying everything's simple and easy and that sort of. That's not what I'm saying. But we have to be reminded of and always return to sort of the basics, the foundation, like you're saying. And then Father Philippe has a way of doing that, of kind of piercing, of piercing through the kind of muddiness of life to say and to remind, okay, this is what matters.
Yeah.
This is what is important for us to focus on and cling to, not the rest of this stuff, but this is the truth. Here's Christ. Now kind of pursue him. And I like the sort of point that you made too, that he's not kind of verbose or like flowery. It's just very direct. Like, this is it. Yeah. And like sometimes when I read Father Philippe, it kind of is like a kick in the gut or something like that. Because it's like, whoa, really you're right. And there's like a call to Christian living and a call to Christian virtue. And like, here it is, plain and simple. Yeah. And there's a beauty in that simplicity and that foundational reality and a reminder of the basics. And he does it in a way. And I think we were talking about this off camera, but he does it in a way that reaches, or that's reachable, or that, whether you're just starting out in the spiritual life as like a super beginner, someone who's trying to get back into things, someone who's, been spending time, us who are religious, not that we're experts in prayer, but we kind of live in a world of kind of prayer and that rhythm that's set up for that. And even for perhaps even like, people who are super, super proficient in the spiritual life can gain from Father Philippe.
You kind of said we can overcomplicate things, but Father Jacques Philippe's writings are very simple. And it's a reminder that like this stuff is more arithmetic than algebra.
Right.
And that's why it's so accessible across the spectrum of the spiritual life. For the beginners. And I suggest his books. They're typically the exact books I suggest to somebody who shows up in my office and saying, okay, I think I need to take my faith seriously. I have no idea where to begin. What do I do? It's like, okay, here's a book by Jacques Philippe. Like, read this. This will get you started.
Yeah.
And then there are people who have been years and years and saying like, okay, I have a really strong devotional life. I have, living and pursuing virtue and growth in the sacraments and grace and all these things. What do I do next? And I'll hand them a Jacques Philippe book. I'm like, okay, go back to this, read this, because he's hitting the basics and the foundations that are perennial, and they are of great fruit to anybody along the different ages of the spiritual life and those types of things. That it is always a good reminder of those basics to really strengthen those in the foundations. So no matter where you are, and I think that's a really, really interesting point, because there are some people like, oh, it's talking about like the simple things. Like, I've progressed past that. No, you haven't. Right. You could always do better at those.
Right. Yeah. And it's kind of the point, as you're saying that, I'm thinking that, there are things as we grow in our relationship with Christ, as we pursue holiness, as we grow in virtue, all of these things, there are things that we can sort of add into our disciplines and our practices. Yeah. But the Christian life isn't in the end about adding and having like bigger checklists. It's about growing more deeply in what is.
Yeah.
And I think we lose sight of that sometimes, or it's easy. Like, if I just do this and this and tack this on and do this better, then okay, I'll be more set. But really it's about like diving into what is good, true, and beautiful, more and more, being drawn in by grace. So it's that sticking, no matter kind of what stage you may find yourself. And I think there's an ebb and flow back and forth, it's not just like climbing up the ladder, we're kind of whatever. But Father Philippe kind of reminds you of like, okay, here are the basics that I need to like move with and move more deeply into. So kind of set that up. What I think might be cool to do is highlight at least some themes that we think are kind of found throughout Father's writings, and then talk about those a little bit. So we have a few quotes here too. So one of my favorite books, and I think one of yours too, or at least by way of recommending of Father Philippe's, is his book called Interior Freedom.
1000%.
It's great. It's excellent. If you're looking for a place to start with Father Philippe, this is my number one recommendation, Interior Freedom. Yep. And he talks about, it's the title gives it away, right? It's about being free so as to pursue Christ. So he talks about what that looks like. And in part of it, sort of I would say kind of the climax, the height of the book, he talks about the theological virtues, the virtues of faith, hope, and love. And he says this about two of them, about hope and about love. And I'm gonna read you the short quote about them. He says this: "Hope is a choice that often demands an effort. It is easier to worry, get discouraged, be afraid. Hoping means trusting. When we hope, we are not passive, we are acting. Love is also a decision. Sometimes it comes spontaneously, but very often loving people will mean choosing to love them. Otherwise, love would be no more than emotion, even selfishness, and not something that engages our freedom. So, hope is a choice, Father Philippe says. Love is a decision.
Yeah.
There are things we do, obviously moved by grace, but things we do. I don't know. Do you have thoughts about that?
Father Philippe is so beautiful in his writings because he's presenting the faith in a new way, but it's not a new idea.
Right.
He's so rooted in the patrimony of the church in the spiritual life. And what he's saying here is he's presenting in such a direct, beautiful, simple way, but this deep understanding that we draw as Dominicans from St. Thomas Aquinas is that those theological virtues of hope and charity are they perfect the will.
Right.
It's the virtue of faith that perfects the intellect, but hope and charity perfect the will. And so that means it's a choice, it's a decision, and it's an act of will that it's infused with grace and the divine life of God that perfects us in our will. And thus we are united to the one in whose image and likeness we are created. And so he's reiterating that. And yeah, it's a little new presentation of it, but that's not a new idea. And that is just a beautiful understanding and presentation of that he lays before us. And why is all of that? To give us freedom. Right. To allow us to be free and not burdened by anything else around us, to not be burdened by anything else, but to be totally radically free in who we are and united to God.
Right. Well, and it's freedom. It begs the question, well, freedom for what? Like what are we free for? Well, it's free to pursue Christ, to be with Christ. And there's a temptation, and I think it's a perennial one. It's one I think that I suffer from too, to think that in order to go, remember, like not adding things, the Christian life is about adding and adding, but about going deeper and deeper, that in order for me to go deeper, I need X, Y, and Z to be perfectly like, this needs to be taken care of. If only I were more attentive, if only in prayer, if only I were doing this better, if only I was a little more virtuous and a little more, then I could come to know Christ. And what it kind of engenders is a kind of passivity, where we are no longer responsible for cooperating with grace, for moving with how God is moving us in our lives, which just isn't true. It's not that we force God's hand to do things in our lives, but part of growing in holiness, part of growing in prayer is recognizing how it is that God moves and responding to that. And what Father Philippe is saying here, especially with these two of the three theological virtues with hope and love, is that we have to respond.
Yeah.
We have to respond because God is not going to force us. So hope is what? He says hope is a choice. I have to choose to hope in God.
Yeah.
God's not going to make me hope in him. If, whatever changes is not going to make, it's in the particular circumstances that God invites us to share in his life, to hope in him. Love is a decision. It's in those particular circumstances that we're given the grace to love. But we have to cooperate with that. He's not going to force us. So I think that's a super helpful reminder to us that, again, that we don't want to sort of portray like a Pelagianism, like if I try harder, but that where it's a question of like, where are you? What are you? How are you responding to God?
And I remember this book, Interior Freedom. I think we could, wax poetic on it for, days and days and days. But personally, this was a very pivotal book for me. I was going a number of years ago. I was going through a really, really rough situation, and it was like it just kept getting to the point where it's like, man, if only this situation would change. If only this one thing would change, or this one person would come into my life or leave or whatever it was, everything would get better.
Right.
And it was like, nope, no, this is about this kind of freedom that he's moving us to, and that I can be in this moment making those choices for hope.
Right.
To say like, okay, I'm going to actually hope in the Lord. And that's a different thing than just being quote unquote like optimistic.
Sure.
Right.
Sure. It's very different.
And he's so beautiful, and he's presenting the reality of the theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, as different than just kind of these like niceties or platitudes of like silver linings, like, oh yeah, their situations are bad, but here's little ways to kind of feel better about yourself. He's like, no, this is actually a diving.
It's a way of living.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a total like free dive into the depths of God himself.
Mm-hmm.
And that is possible at every moment in every situation.
Right.
If we are totally free to be with God in that moment.
Right.
And that's what he's pushing us towards. And the way to do that is through these theological virtues.
Right. Exactly. So I mean, obviously we're talking about freedom. I think there's this, that theme and that idea you can find throughout almost all of his writing, to be free to pursue Christ, right? So he says this about freedom, which I think is awesome. He says, true freedom is not so much something man wins for himself. It is a free gift from God, a fruit of the Holy Spirit, received in the measure in which we place ourselves in a relationship of loving dependence on our Creator and Savior. This is where the gospel paradox is most apparent. Whoever would save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. In other words, people who wish to preserve and defend their own freedom at any cost will lose it, but those willing to lose it by leaving it trustingly in God's hands will save it. Their freedom will be restored to them infinitely more beautiful, infinitely deeper, as a marvelous gift from God's tenderness. Our freedom is, in fact, proportionate to the love and childlike trust we have for our Heavenly Father. That paradox he talks about, whoever would save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For me, that sometimes I've thought in the past before reading Father Philippe, like, what does it mean to lose my life? What does it mean to lose my life? We can think about losing life with respect to death, but I don't think that's what he's talking about necessarily, or even particularly. But Father Philippe's understanding and sort of what kind of theological, spiritual kind of reading and explanation, exegesis was the word I was trying to think of.
There it is. Yeah, there it is.
It's like, well, how do you lose your life? Well, it's handing your life to God, trusting in him, growing in that trust, being moved by him, giving your life to him. I mean, it's the Christian life. It's what being a disciple is. But it's about letting go so as to be free, letting go in God's hands. And I think, it's, of course, easier said than done.
Of course.
But nonetheless, it's what we're after. And
but
it's
we
what
go for
grace is moving us towards.
This is this paradox. And the ability to, when we truly have freedom, is once we no longer try to obtain it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It's the giving over. I love in the spiritual life about how it seems so paradoxical that what true maturity in the spiritual life looks like is to be looking like a child who's totally dependent on the eternal Father.
Yeah.
Right. It was like we see in the world around us, and natural maturation is to become autonomous, to lose dependency and gain autonomy. But it's almost completely inverted with the spiritual life. True maturity in the spiritual life, one who grows in spiritual life, is one who becomes more dependent, loses their autonomy to become totally dependent on God.
Yeah.
And that's where that true freedom is in that deep union of that dependency upon God. So there is a paradox in that, and to not be afraid of pursuing that, to constantly be reminded of that we have this kind of natural intuition to be in control and to determine our own path forward. But when we look at this, it's actually to allow ourselves to be totally dependent and to surrender completely into the Lord. And that's where we gain our freedom. To lose our life is to gain it.
Right.
And the paradox of how he presents it that way, which once again, not new.
Basic.
This is basic stuff,
Yeah.
but it's so important to always be reiterating. We both played sports growing up, right? There's never a moment that you would progress past the fundamentals.
Right.
You always can go back to those basic skill sets of the sport. And I think it's so too with the spiritual life. And Father Jacques is one of the best coaches for the fundamentals of the spiritual life.
Exactly. Well, in the last handful of minutes, I think let's talk about one last theme that permeates, and that's his Father Philippe's kind of thought on the present moment, on the present. So Father Philippe insists throughout his books on that we have to live in the present.
Yeah.
And that's not a kind of like YOLO, you got to like find yourself now, kind of thing, but it's really it's underpinned by a theological reality in that God is an eternal present. There is no past in God. There is no future in God. And God has not acted only once in our past, and he's not waiting to act in our future. He's acting now in our lives. He offers himself in each moment of our lives. And if we're not focused on that, if we're so concerned or trapped by the past or so worried about the future, then we're actually missing God's hand in what's happening now, where he operates and where he offers his grace. So he says this about the present moment, and I think this is like spot on. So he says, we may spend our whole lives waiting to live. Thus, we risk not fully accepting the reality of our present lives. Yet, what guarantee is there that we won't be disappointed when the long-awaiting time comes? Meanwhile, we don't put our heart sufficiently in today, and so miss graces we should be receiving. Let us live each moment to the full, not worrying about whether time is going quickly or slowly, but welcoming everything given us moment by moment. I love that. We may spend our whole lives waiting to live. It's like cuts to the core.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I was kind of mentioning this earlier, probably got ahead of myself, but Father Jacques Philippe's writings were really, really pivotal for me. And it's precisely in this area that we can kind of almost paralyze ourselves waiting to live.
Right.
And if we are doing that, then we're actually more burdened by our circumstances. And we become so connected to the circumstances of our lives, and that we're waiting for something else to change, somebody else to make a move and change things, because maybe the situation we're in right now is not the most conducive to our prayer life. And that's real. There are certain contexts and circumstances that are more conducive to a healthy prayer life and in pursuit of relationship with Jesus. There are others that are less conducive to that. But we can sit back and say like, oh, I'm just waiting for these things to change, and then I will live a real life. I'll wait for this change to happen, be in a better job or get a promotion or this relationship to end in my life. And then I can actually then have the freedom to start. And what he's talking about is, no, you can do this right now because God is in this moment.
Right.
Exactly. That you don't have to be kind of tied to and burdened by both the past as well as the hypothetical future. You can be radically free and united to Christ in this moment, no matter what the circumstances are. And like I said, there can be some that are more conducive to it than not, but it doesn't eliminate it. If we get so hyper-focused on what the possibilities are, waiting until something's the perfect setting, we're never actually going to get there. And that's exactly what he says, is that we'll never actually live.
Right. Yeah, and that's not to say that the past has no effect on us, it hasn't shaped us, or that the future is not something we should like be prudent about or that sort of thing. But it's a question of like, what is our focus? And just as you were saying, what is our focus? What are we aimed at? And is it something that we have no control over, or is it where we have control, where our Lord offers himself, where we can respond actively, like we were talking about the theological virtues, where we can move towards what is being offered. So, okay, so that's Father Philippe. We mentioned one of the books. He has probably a dozen or so, if not more, books.
And he keeps writing.
He does keep writing. Yeah,
he just wrote another book that was published last few months. I got it from my mother for Christmas this past year. Yeah. So yeah, he just keeps writing new things.
So I always recommend Interior Freedom. He has a book on the Beatitudes. He has a number of books on prayer. He has a book on Saint Therese. He has books on the Holy Spirit. There's another one that you really like too, besides Interior Freedom.
When people are saying like, where do I begin? The two places I send the two books of Jacques Philippe's that we go with is Interior Freedom, and the second one is Time for God.
Yeah, also
like
great.
Those are the two that I always suggest to begin with.
Yeah, the Time for God book called Time for God is a bit more focused on like actual prayer, like how to pray and making time for God. So the title yet again gives it away. So
the best part of that book, and I don't want to delay us too much, but the best part of that is like he says, just show up.
Yeah,
the fidelity to prayer is itself the greatest grace. So like he starts to evaporate all that aspects of like, I don't know if I'm getting anything out of prayer. I don't see the effects. Is it really doing? He's like, no, just keep going. just keep going.
Right.
And it's a really encouraging book to then begin this life of prayer in this life of union with Christ.
Well, there you have it. Father Jacques Philippe, if you're looking for something to read, pick him up. Highly recommended.
10 out of 10.
Great. Okay. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Godsplaining. If you like the episode and would like to help contribute to the project, please consider becoming a monthly donor on Patreon. Also, if you wouldn't mind liking, subscribing to the podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts on YouTube, that's super helpful for us. You can check out our website for other information on our upcoming events, on our merchandise. All of that is there for you. Know of our prayers for you. Please pray for us, and we'll see you next time on Godsplaining.